There is a fifth dimension, beyond that which is known to man. It is a dimension as vast as space and as timeless as infinity. It is a middle ground between light and shadow, between science and superstition, and it lies between the pit of man's fears and the summit of his knowledge. This is a dimension of imagination. It is an area which we call the Twilight Zone. Hey guys, Alf here. I'm finally back with another Analyzing Twilight Zone, and we're on Season 1, Episode 11. This episode is titled, And When the Sky Was Opened. It was directed by Douglas Hayes, and the teleplay was written by Rod Serling, based on Disappearing Act by Richard Matheson. Richard Matheson is probably one of my favorite writers of all time, probably in the top 3. Yeah, this is the first episode he did. A lot of the episodes he did were great. This episode's really good too. It has a really interesting idea, although now I think it may be a bit overdone, but at the time I'm sure this was a very fresh idea. So let me break down the story for you. The story opens up with a bit of exposition about an aircraft that flew into space, experimental aircraft. It disappeared from radar for a while and then was found crashed in a desert. So after that, the scene changes to a military hospital, and we are introduced to a character called Colonel Forbes. And you could tell he's a bit distraught. He enters one of the hospital rooms where another character we meet called Major Gart is. And, he's still recovering from the crash. They were both part of the flight. And you could tell Forbes is very distraught, and he's, questioning the younger Major Gart. And he starts asking him all these questions of what he remembers. So apparently all that Gart remembers is that the both of them got on the flight, they went up into space, and then a little while later they blacked out and woke up in the desert. Colonel Forbes agrees that that's what happened, but he says that there's one piece missing, and he starts questioning him as whether he knows who Colonel Harrington is, another person who Colonel Forbes says was on the flight with them, and that they've been friends with him for years. They've known him for years. They both left the hospital yesterday morning. They were both discharged because they weren't, ill as Gart is. Gart says he doesn't remember him at all. He said that didn't happen. It was just me and you who went up there. It wasn't both of us. So, this makes Forbes freak out a little more, and he's, really kind of looks like he's going crazy. So he tells them, look, maybe if I explain to you everything that happened chronologically since yesterday morning when we woke up in this hospital, and maybe you'll remember then. So then now we get a flashback sequence. So now the scene changes to the morning before the day we were on, and so now we're introduced to Colonel Harrington, and all three of them are in the hospital room with Gart. They're all goofing around, blah, blah. They're like, you'll get out of here in no time, and when you do, we're going to take you out for drinks. There's a part where Harrington goes to, a counter, and he picks up a newspaper, and he looks at the front page, and it shows all three of them, together, a picture of them saying, the 3 astronauts that came back from space, blah, blah, blah. But, they all laugh and they leave, and Harrington and Forbes go to a bar to unwind. They get there, they see a pretty woman at the bar, and, they both kind of rush to sit next to her, but Forbes ends up sitting next to her. The bartender comes over and says, hey, aren't you those guys that went off into space, blah, blah, They were like, oh, yeah, but we could still buy a beer for 30 Earth dollars, right? For 30 Earth cents, right? Yeah, 30 cents was what a beer cost in those days, by the way. Amazing. So the bartender gives them their drinks. The guy, Forbes, starts talking to the woman, and he looks back at Harrington. He's got a weird face on, and he's like, oh, are you all right, man? And he was like, yeah, I think so. And he's like, are you feeling sick? And he's like, no. And then he takes a sip of his beer, and afterwards he's kind of spins in his chair a little bit and drops the beer and smashes on the ground. The bartender's like, oh, it's okay, there's more beer, don't worry about it, and he gives him a beer. And the guy, he's still looking weird. Again, Forbes is like, hey, are you okay? And he's like, yeah, I just have this weird feeling. And then he says he's going to go call his parents. So he goes to the payphone in the corner of the bar. It's like a little booth. So he goes inside the booth. He picks up the phone, and it skips forward a bit after the call. And Harrington sticks his head out the booth and calls Forbes over So, and he says, can you please come here quick? And then Forbes comes over, and he's like, yeah, what's the matter? And Harrington tells him, I just called my parents, and my mother said that she never had a son. She never heard of Ed Harrington. And so, he asked to speak to the father, his father. His father comes on the phone, tells him, hey, leave my wife alone with your practical jokes and stuff. I never had a son. And he's like, oh, what could that mean to Forbes? And Forbes saying, I don't know. They're probably playing a gag on you. And he's like, no, it's not a gag. I think it has to do with this weird feeling I have. I feel like we shouldn't be here. It's like, we went into space and we weren't supposed to come back, but something made a mistake and let us back. And if I let go, I feel like I'm going to disappear. So Forbes is like, all right, this, he's not doing well. He says, let me go get you a drink. He goes to go get a drink. And as he's walking back to the bar, something on one of the tables where people are sitting catches his eye, and it's a newspaper, and he picks it up and looks at it. And it only shows him and Gart on it now, and that's the front page saying that only two men went into space. And he's like, what the hell? So he looks back at the phone booth, and there's no one there now. He runs back, he looks at it really good, and he's like, what the hell? So he goes back to the bartender, and he says, hey, where's my buddy's drink? And the guy's like, what? What are you talking about? And he looks down, and that broken, and he was like, the one in place of the one he dropped. And he looks down, and the glass isn't there anymore. There was nothing, there's no spill, there's no broken glass. And he's like, hey, what's going on here? And the bartender's like, I don't know what you're talking about. You came in here alone. So, he's about to flip out on him, doesn't say anything. And he's like, there's some kind of joke or something. But then he realizes, he looks down at the newspaper again, only shows two people. And he kind of flips out and he starts calling everyone crazy. And they're like, you're all crazy. He throws the newspaper and he leaves.
You're crazy. You're crazy. You're crazy. You're crazy!
So now the scene switches and we're in a hotel room. Forbes is pacing back and forth, and he picks up the phone. He calls the Air Force and asks to speak to the commanding officer. They say he's not around. It's super late at night, by the way. So, they say he's not around, and he's like, yeah, could you please have him call me back? Gets off, then he walks to the counter. He's like looking at his things, and then he hears a knock, and he thinks it's Harrington. He's like, yeah, oh, there he is, and he opens the door. But when he opens the door, it's his girlfriend. Maybe his wife, fiance, whatever, but it seems like girlfriend. She doesn't have a wedding ring on. And she's upset, and he's like, oh my God, he hugs her, and he's like, oh, I'm in so much trouble, I need your help. And she's pissed off. She's like, you told me to meet you at the train station at 12. I was there at 12 and at 1 and at 2, and I waited. I went to every bar in the area and every motel, blah, blah, blah. She's pissed off, and he sits down. And he's, obviously distraught, and he starts freaking out, and he's like, please, really loud yelling. And that's when she realizes, okay, something's really going on. She comes over and hugs him, and she's like, what's the matter? What trouble are you in? And he starts talking to her, starts telling her about Ed. She was like, oh my God, nobody remembers Ed. She was like, but you sent me a telegram to meet you, and that clicks in his mind, and he's like, I sent you a telegram. I said Ed and I were going to meet you at the train station, So he runs and sees, yeah, I wrote it down. Where's the paper? I wrote down the telegram, and he picks it up, and, he finds the paper, he picks it up, and walks to her and opens it up, and he says, see, look, I'm going to meet you at the, and he's like, oh, what? And he's like, no, I wrote Ed and I, and he's like flipping out. And she's like, what are you talking about? And he's like, Ed and I were going to meet you. And she's like, I don't know who you're talking about. I don't know any Ed, and he starts grabbing her, and he's like yelling, like, what? He's like, you met him 100 times. We've double dated. We've gone to dances and ate together, gone out to dinner together. And she's like, I don't know what you're talking about, and he's kind of starting to flip out. And then the phone rings. So he picks it up, and it's the commanding officer of the Air Force. And, and he was like, I'm sorry I called you this late, but I wanted to ask you about Ed Harrington. And then, you don't hear the other side, but then he's like, Ed Harrington, so he starts flipping out on the phone now, yelling, Ed Harrington, why doesn't anybody remember Ed Harrington? He slams the phone, and then he gets up, he's cracked a bit, he's, and he's got a little smile, and he's like, I get it, this is a gag, you guys all got together, and you're playing a practical joke on me. Ed's probably still back at the bar, isn't he? And he walks out into the balcony, but it's not really a balcony, it's like the first floor. So he jumps over the railing of the balcony and runs off into the night, basically. But he ends up back at the bar, which is closed now because it's super late. And he's like banging on the window, and he's like, Ed, and then he's getting frustrated. He kind of gives up, and then he just smashes through the plain glass doorway of entrance of the bar, right? Like fucking the Incredible Hulk type shit, or like the Kool-Aid guy. Oh yeah.
Harrington. Harrington!
And he's yelling for Ed, and then he kind of gives up, and you see like in defeat, and he's kind of like lowly saying, Ed, where are you? And he's knocking over chairs, he's flipping out. He goes to the phone booth, which was the last place he saw Harrington, and he sits down in the chair, and he's starting to sob. He's saying, Ed, come back, come back. So now the flashback ends, and we're back to Forbes in the hospital room with Gart, just them two. He's ending up the story, and he's like, and I just wandered the streets after the bar. I don't even know what, I left my girlfriend at that motel. I don't even know what happened to her. And he's like, and now I'm here. And, Gart is like, I'm really sorry, man, but I don't know Ed Harrington. I've never heard of him. He must have been an illusion or something, And Forbes is like, no, I know he's not an illusion. And he's like, man, it's weird. This is so weird. And he starts thinking, Harrington said it. He said it's like something made a mistake letting us come back, and we weren't supposed to be here. We don't belong. And he's like, and soon it's going to come for us, And he's like, man, I feel weird. And he walks up to the mirror and he looks at it, and he's like, I think he starts realizing he's disappearing. You don't see it, but he's getting that feeling that Ed Harrington was describing before, the feeling of not belonging. And he really starts flipping out now, and he's like, no, I don't want it to happen. I don't want it to happen. He grabs the kid, and I don't want it to happen. And then he runs out the hospital room. And as the Gart gets up to go look, you can hear him yelling down the hall, I don't want it to happen. I don't want it to happen. But then it stops right when Gart reaches the doorway. And when he looks out, there's nobody in the hallway. And he's like yelling like, Forbes. The nurse comes, and she's like, Major Gart, you should be in bed. And she's like, you got to stop him. You got to go get Colonel Forbes. She's looking at him like, what? And he's like, Colonel Forbes, and he came in here with me. And she's like, no, you came in here alone. And he's like, no, he was in that bed, right? And when he turns around, he notices the bed's gone, and the hospital room only has one bed now. And he's like, he starts flipping out, and he's like almost, completely strucken with fear. And the nurse grabs him, she puts him back in the bed, and she's like, let me get the doctor. Stay here, relax. Let me go get the doctor. So when she leaves their hotel room, he gets up and looks at the newspaper, and now he's absolutely stricken with fear when he sees that the only person on the front page is him, and it says lone astronaut returns from space, and it's just him, and he basically is so stricken with fear that he becomes catatonic and lays down in the bed. Then the scene skips, and we go down the hallway where the nurse is with a military personnel who's asking about, we need an empty room, we're going to be making some changes in this hospital. And she says, yeah, there's an empty room over here. She takes them to the room where the astronauts were, opens up the door. Sure enough, the door's complete. The room's completely empty. The scene ends there, and we go back to the beginning where they were showing, when they were doing the exposition about the experimental aircraft going off to space, and there is no experimental aircraft. It's not there and never came back. So that's the end of the story. It's a really good one. I enjoy it, but, people zapping out of existence has kind of been done plenty of times now. At the time, it was probably a very fresh story, and it was cool. I remember when I watched it as a kid, it was interesting to me, and I found it to be completely fascinating. So there's a little bit of trivia for this story. Not much, though, but the original script, this was loosely based on Richard Matheson's Disappearing Act. I'm not sure what the differences were, but I'm sure that it was not written to the same. The teleplay Rod Serling wrote, a lot of stuff was changed as they were doing it. The director had changed stuff, like the part where I was talking about where Forbes busts through the glass of the bar door. They thought that, it would make sense because he was in such a crazed fever pitch that he just, that him crashing through would be nuts. And, they showed the scene to Rod Serling, and Rod Serling said, yep, that's cool, Originally, Rod Serling wrote the crash landing of the ship into the script, but it was too expensive, so they couldn't film it, so they had to, so that's why there's that exposition at the beginning where he just explains that it happened. For the part where Forbes is disappearing, Rod Serling wrote it so that he was terrified the whole time, but instead, Douglas Hayes thought the sensation of being pulled from existence should be a euphoric feeling, and that's why in that scene he's kind of like smiling and, like it's feeling good, kind of, until he finally realizes what's happening, and he flips out, The title of this story comes from a children's nursery rhyme called Sing a Song of Sixpence, And the line is, when the pie was opened, the birds began to sing. Wasn't that a dainty dish to set before a king? Which, the story is when the sky was opened. That's where the name comes from. But then I have this other conflicting story. Maybe it comes from both. Oh, well, they're saying it's a parody line, but this one is an actual quote from Acts 10:11 of the Bible, where it says, "And he saw the sky opened up and an object like a great sheet coming down, lowered by four corners of the ground." Yeah, I guess that could be another place where they got it from. I guess they're not totally sure. It could be from either. Another interesting tidbit is Charles Aidman, who played Colonel Ed Harrington, later became the narrator of the 1985 rendition of The Twilight Zone for the first two seasons. And then also, Gart disappears pretty quickly at the end, where it took a while for it to happen to Harrington, and then Forbes went looking for him, and eventually it happened to him. But for both of them it took a while, but for Gart it happened so quick. And Rod Serling describes this as being a thing where Gart was anchored into reality by the other two. So by the other two disappearing, there was nothing to keep him anchored to this world, and he disappeared a lot faster, which kind of gives us the idea that Colonel Forbes was kept in this earth from trying to deny the possibility that it's happening, and he was in denial, right? He thought Ed was still around and that there was a gag, so he held on a long time. But hearing the story from Forbes and then seeing it happen right in front of him, it's already been explained to him, and there was no way of him denying the possibility, so he let go a lot quicker than the other two did. So that was a cool episode. I really like this one, but there's not much to talk about it, like what it could mean and stuff. I mean, in the end, it's just talking about maybe what is reality and who we are and stuff like that. But there's nothing too deep about it. It's more of a sci-fi, interesting tale, Well, now that we're done with this one, the next one will be episode 12 of season 1, What You Need, which is one that I enjoy very much, and I'll try to get that out next week. Thanks for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. Peace.
Oh no. Oh no! I don't want this to happen! Phil, I don't want it to happen! I don't want it to happen!